Hello, everyone. Please type in the chat box where you are from, your company, and your role. Ready your pen and journal and write your thoughts. And since we're expecting quite a number of participants, please be on mute at all times. Your thoughts and questions are welcome in the chat section. Good afternoon, PMappers. My name is JP Villanueva. I'm the Human Capital Strategy and Service Architect for Viventis Search Asia, and I will be your moderator for today's free webinar. Building Grisiliency and Thriving Amidst COVID-19 is hosted by the People Management Association of the Philippines. Now, due to the enhanced quarantine, all of us are in different parts of the metro and the country. So in case of technical difficulties, please bear with us. To accommodate everyone aside from Zoom, we are currently streaming on PMAP's YouTube channel. If you cannot access the Zoom link, please go to YouTube and search for the page of PMAP. That is People Management Association of the Philippines, or look for official PMAP 1956. For the Q&A segment, you may send your questions using the Zoom chat box, or for those watching on YouTube, please post your questions as comments. Now let's welcome our main resource person. James, please introduce yourself and please tell us, how would you define Grisiliency? What is Grisiliency?
First off, welcome, PMappers. It's great to see so many of you joining us today. And I'm so excited to be teamed with JP to share our insights on today's timely topic. Yeah, as you guys can see on the opening slide in the quotation marks, Grisiliency. It's a term that we coined years ago. It's a combination of the term grit and resilience. You put those together, essentially that's how we define mindset.
Okay, so you said, James, it's a combination of grit and resiliency. And you said these are facets of mindset. And this is something very important at this time. And for all our learners and participants during this session, we hope that this session will give you key skills, or what we call core skills. Core stands for control, ownership, reach, and endurance. And we will talk a lot about this a little bit later. And we hope that you will use these skills with ease and mastery, especially when adversity strikes or in preparation for unwelcome scenarios at work and in life. And I think it's important that for you, our dear learners and our dear participants, we just want to know from you and perhaps ask you to set your learning intention today. What do you personally want to learn in this session? Maybe it's great for you to tell James what you want to especially learn today. Please type your answers at the chat box. So we initially talked about resiliency as a combination of grit and resiliency. And we hope that you will be able to use skills of control, ownership, reach, and endurance with ease and mastery. But personally, what do you want to learn in this session? Please type that in the chat box so James can monitor your learning objectives for today. Please do that now. Thank you. Okay, and by the way, James, we had the chance to ask our participants and our learners, and we got also some answers from them in a series of questions in a survey, and we got to see their responses to this particular question. We had about 4 qualitative questions for them. The first question was, how did you react when the enhanced community quarantine was announced? So this is going back to the first announcement. I think that was the 2nd week of March back then when the community quarantine was announced. And we picked out key answers of their reactions, and here they are. It's a plethora of reactions. It's a huge spread. There are varied ways, and there are unique ways of reacting, in fact. And in also, I was thinking, okay, how do we make sense of different reactions, like initially getting anxious and uncertain. Others started looking to ensure safety and follow the key measures presented by the government. Others tried to read a number of articles about COVID-19. So I was thinking one way of making sense of what we heard from our participants is, and I learned this from Dr. Liz Miller. And one thing that I noticed about our reactions, especially when the enhanced community quarantine was announced, is that our reactions actually happen in different energy levels. There are those that appeared in high energy, like panicking, or getting surprised, or following measures, doing something about it, or getting anxious, in fact. Or those with low energy, like for some, it didn't sink in as yet. Another dimension is that our reactions are either pleasant or unpleasant to us, right? Some feel negative, others feel positive. Uh, and it's a full range of reactions. But what I really noticed is that each of us react uniquely when the whole enhanced community quarantine was announced. What's your take on our learners' reaction seeing this slide, James?
Well, actually, JP, I'm not surprised. In fact, notice that most of those responses fall on the right-hand side, on the positive side. I'm sorry, and the negative side, but they all fall on the high energy. And that's no shocker. When most adversities strike, especially the major ones like house fire, personal attack, calamities, or pandemic, our body immediately goes into something known as fight and flight response. The part of the brain most responsible for this is the basal ganglia region, which regulates things like motor learning, executive function, behaviors, emotions, etc. But the good news is that we don't have to be slaves of this process, of our amygdala and our hypothalamus. In fact, I'll be sharing a slice of the science behind this a bit later in the presentation.
Yeah, so that's perfect. So that means to say, James, what I'm getting from you is that in any abnormal situation, especially that of a pandemic, our range of reactions are actually normal.
Oh, very normal. Absolutely. This is exactly what we would expect, even from a scientific perspective.
Right, right. And then we also asked our learners and participants how they were able to cope 2 weeks after the implementation of the community quarantine. And the interesting part here is somehow the elements of the different quadrants changed. And maybe what is good is to label the quadrants, right? I think we have learned in life that anything that is unlabeled is hard to manage. So let's put a little labeling to the quadrants. So the upper left is agitation, the lower left is helplessness, the upper right is action, and the lower right is calmness. Okay, and these are the reactions 2 weeks after. Okay, some are still adjusting, so it's between feeling negative or feeling positive. The others are starting to cope better. Others started to step back and learn. A lot more are still fearful after 2 weeks. Others are very worried because there are still rising cases. Also, there are those who are concerned with the government's countermeasures, whether they are enough. Others have also created their own routine already. Someone started urban gardening in his place. Others continue to verify what's fake news and which ones are the true ones. And the others, just to cope, is to limit the exposure to news. But what I noticed is that 2 weeks after, some of the responses actually never stayed in one quadrant. In fact, I find it dangerous. For example, for 2 weeks, you're staying in the upper left, the agitation part. That is quite dangerous, right? So what I notice is that there is actually movement in the four quadrants. We can either stay in one quadrant or move to another at will. So for example, there are a number of those who 2 weeks before were in the agitation quadrant, but they somehow tried to step back. They moved to low energy, feeling positive by trying to step back and come down and try to find some level of balance. And then that's the time that the moment everything has subsided, they have moved up to action. There are also those who move to the uh, to the calmness quadrant, but somehow a lot of triggers came up and went back to agitation. The others who are in the agitation phase went down to helplessness. Others felt helpless because they could not do anything. In fact, I know of a number of friends who felt guilty that they cannot do something about the situation. But those who found themselves in the area of helplessness also tried to not stay in the helplessness areas and move back to calmness. So again, my key observation here is, again, as I said, we can either stay in one quadrant or move to another at will, or also we can navigate through the quadrants depending on our reading of the situation. Most importantly, what I observed is that the quadrant of calmness, the lower right, is our pivot point, whether to move to action or move to agitation or move out of helplessness. Uh, is navigating through these quadrants a sign of resiliency, James?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if you move from the left to the right or from the negative side over to the positive, yeah, that's a strong indicator of what we call high resiliency. And conversely, the same can be said if you go from right to left. For example, if you move from action and calmness to one of those states on the left, agitation or helplessness, that's an indicator that our resiliency is actually waning, which of course is quite possible.
Okay, so perfect. Now let's try to check where are our participants and learners at this point in time. We got to ask them how are you coping with the enhanced community quarantine at this time? I think we are on our fifth or our sixth week, in fact, of being in quarantine already. So we checked on everybody how they are, and this is the result. A number of us have started to get the hang of things. In fact, a lot of us tried to live and learned how to live a monastic life now. Um, Others are now starting to think of a new normal. How can I possibly how can things possibly be like in the new normal? How will my organization be like in the new normal? Others try to be very positive and hopeful about what's going on. Others become a lot more stable in working from home and learning from home. Uh, the rest also having known that there is possible lifting of the quarantine in 2 weeks time, so they are excited for ECQ lifting, but others are afraid of the lifting of the ECQ also because cases could possibly shoot up. There are still a number of us who are still scared and anxious and still unsure of what will happen. There are those of us who've lost our jobs, right? And interestingly, however, they are finding a way to rely on information, on the right information, learning to accept the situation also. The others are moving up to the action phase where they're looking for alternatives already. They try to be productive with work, and they are somehow managing their time a lot better. They keep communications open, especially with their teams and their family. I've talked to a couple of frontliners. In fact, my own sister is a frontliner in Houston She's a medical technologist, so a number of those test tubes are being handed to her. I check on a number of friends who are frontliners also from time to time, but they are actually making sure that they follow protocols, and they ensure that they get the hang out of things, and find a certain routine, a new routine, a new habit. And we got the chance also to ask, and if you will notice, slowly a number of responses moved to the right side, right? Um, Another thing is we asked our participants, what are you planning as we slowly edge into post-peak and post-pandemic phases? Here, it looks like the participants are now planning how to stabilize things, right? They are beginning to see a new normal. A number have moved. In fact, upon planning, we don't see anyone wanting to stay in the agitation box, right? So a lot would want to continue to connect with coworkers and family and plan for their future. Others who have been in a number of webinars, especially from PMAP, are applying their learning to their strategies already. Some HR practitioners are planning how to engage their talent with a possible combination of 50% working from home and 50% or probably a skeletal workforce working in the office, and how to keep employees without laying off. A number of them are doing positive actions and keeping the momentum. Also, some have learned to give value to life and be more grateful, and then also be mindful about health protocols. So we're seeing a certain level of calmness, and while at the same time looking at ways to do something about their situation. How do you find the plans of our participants, James? Do they seem optimal from a Grisiliency perspective?
Well, it's funny you should ask. I'm actually in the process of composing an article, and I have some information here in front of me. It's from a Gallup poll conducted in 2009, where over 150,000 adults in more than 140 countries were asked the question, what do you think life's going to be like in terms of quality over the next 5 years? Good or better or worse than their current life? 95% of individuals in that survey across 160 countries expected their life in 5 years to be as good or better than their life is now or even 5 years ago. Now,
Oh, wow.
yeah, believe it or not, that's no surprise. Or it's no surprise that most of the responses from our PMAppers fall on the right side, the positive side. However,
Okay.
we have to be prepared for old habits to resurface. We must understand the hardwired patterns of response to these adversities and how to improve these responses. In fact, we'll cover this, of course, later in the presentation precisely.
Yes. And I think my key insight there is we simply have it all starts with self-awareness. It's knowing when we are slipping back to the agitation or to the helplessness quadrant, and then just slowly move to the calmness quadrant again. So just to recap everything that we got from our participants, notice that the questions come in a timeline. It's the first question was about when the quarantine was announced, then 2 weeks after, then how they are doing now, and what they're planning in the future. I think what then is important is to know that we have unique reactions. All of us have unique reactions, and our reactions change depending on the phases of the pandemic. Maybe initially, when no one is affected inside the country back then, some of us are curious, others are in denial, the rest are in business as usual and wouldn't really care as much. But when we started to have sustained human-to-human transmission in the Philippines, a lot of us started to be anxious, to be fearful, to be overwhelmed. And then 2 weeks after we started to be creative, a lot of us have discovered new menus to cook at home, and being creative about what we can do inside inside our houses, and noticing even places that we haven't noticed inside our house before. The others have remained concerned also, especially of their loved ones. I was personally concerned with my parents because they live in the province, and uh, uh, not one of our siblings is there. So and I'm the firstborn. So they are top of mind for me. And then now that we are slowly easing to the post-peak phase of the pandemic, everyone is starting to be cautious about their health, their wellness, even cautious about distance, social distancing. Others have started to be very, very empathetic of their neighbors, checking on their neighbors, especially. The rest have started to be irritated, actually, because we could not actually predict when the whole quarantine phase will happen. So sometimes we slide back to the anxiety phase. But the most important thing is, as we move forward, we have to find a way to define what will be our new normal. Can we actually control our new normal? Can we actually have a sense of ownership of our new normal? And also, can we establish new habits? Can we establish a more healthy set of habits moving forward? Can there be a new way of relating also? My main learning about mental health is it's all about relationships, our relationships with ourselves, our relationship with others, our relationships with the world, our relationship with our God. So what's gonna be a new way of relating, and how do we endure the marathon of the whole quarantine, because we still do not know if the quarantine will end in 2 weeks time or not, right? And I think this is where, James, you come in, and let us know, how can we practice control, ownership, reach, and endurance to create new normal, to find new habits, and to find a new way of relating in this new time, in this new age of ours.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, JP, for that. And give me just one moment and I'll pull up my presentation and we'll continue from there.
Sure. For those of you who just came in, welcome to the session.
All right, guys, and welcome again, PMappers, and of course, those who are just joining. To continue the conversation, let's talk about the term that you see on the screen. In every single one of my workshops, I always show this slide. Notice the head. Notice what's inside the head, that silhouette, that tree. Now, below the center line, we see roots there. And what that represents is that all of the emotions that you guys shared in that questionnaire that we saw appear on the screen, in whichever quadrant they may have fell in, they're all rooted in our mindset. But there's a problem with this term that you see on the screen, this term mindset. In fact, I ask people all the time, can you give me the definition of mindset? And immediately I see a blank look go over their face. They're like, And then they start throwing out synonyms, positive buzzwords, things that, are, similar to mindset, but they can't articulate. They can't define this term. And that's a problem. Well, we have a very clear definition for mindset, and here it is. First, mindset can be thought of in two ways, or two sides of the same coin. First, half of your mindset is what we call your adversity quotient, your defensive stance when adversity strikes. Think of it as your shield, what you would use to defend yourself when the universe throws its slings and arrows your way. How do you respond? Well, that's half of mindset, the defensive side. And the other side, of course, would be your offense, your grit, your capacity to sacrifice, struggle, and suffer, to dig deep within yourself and to experience, to harness those three S's, to achieve your most worthy goals in the best ways possible. So if AQ is your shield, well, then grit would be your sword, your weapon of choice, what you would use to thrash through those barriers and make it to the goals that matter to you most. So the next time anyone asks you, what do you mean by mindset? You can say, oh, it's quite simple. It's offense, defense, grit, and AQ. Now today, we're going to be focusing a lot on the defensive side because as we all know, we're facing unprecedented circumstances at this time. In fact, the last time we had a pandemic like this was in the early 1900s with the Spanish flu. So the question here is, well, what are the differences between people who bend and those who break in the midst of an adversity? You might remember the old story of the bamboo versus the oak tree. And when the typhoon blows in, and once the wind subsides and the adversity clears, which one is still standing? Obviously, it's the bamboo, because the bamboo was flexible, agile, able to bend, unlike the mighty oak, which tried to stand its ground, but eventually lost, broke, and crumpled over. So I guess the question is, okay, during this adversity, this ECQ, this pandemic, how are we responding? Well, I'm happy to see, based on your responses to our questionnaire, that for the most part, a lot of you were on that right side. Whether it was the high or low energy, definitely we saw a ton of responses on the right side. So already I'm thinking to myself, wow, for all of you in attendance, for all of you who did our survey and our questionnaire, if I was a betting man, I would wager that if we were to assess you, your AQ and your grit, chances are a lot of you would score quite highly. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, test? Is there a way to test our AQ and our grit? The answer is absolutely. In fact, let me share 4 key facts based on 35 years of our scientific research. Our global institute, located in California, was founded in 1987. So we're talking a while. And in all that time, we have established conclusively that when it comes to how we respond as humans to our adversities, these are hardwired patterns of the brain. In fact, over 95% of what we do when we are consciously awake is a hardwired pattern of your brain. I mean, let me give you some examples. When you took a shower this morning, assuming you took a shower, where did you start? Did you start here, work your way down? Did you start at your knees and work your way up? Think about that physical process. Now, how did you do it yesterday? The day before? It's likely your answer is, well, the same. And in fact, you probably weren't even conscious of these motions, the way we brush our teeth, the way you're sitting in front of your laptop right now, or your computer, listening to this webinar, or laying in your bed perhaps. Your posture is a hardwired pattern. But we don't consciously choose to sit like this. In fact, when I said the word posture, I bet some of you right now started to adjust your posture in your chair. It's because simply by saying the word, I broke the spell. I broke that hardwired pattern. I made you conscious of it. Well, the same is true when we respond to adversity. When lightning strikes, we react. When the ECQ was announced, we reacted. But the question is, did you react optimally? Now, let's be honest. In that survey, that questionnaire we sent, in the beginning, when you first heard about the ECQ, a lot of those responses were on the left side or on the negative side. And again, that's no surprise. Here's our second fact. We are often poor judges of these patterns that happen in our brains until someone like me points them out to you, like posture. Fact number 3, we can measure these patterns scientifically. There are 2 ways that we can do this. One, and we've done this, we have actually hooked people up to fMRIs, UC Berkeley, and we scan the human brain to see what parts of it light up when people think about adverse situations. And like I shared earlier, it's that primordial part of our brain, right near the stem, where our ancient simian primate genes surface and we react in those ways, that fight and flight response. Another way we can measure AQ is through online assessments, known as the AQ profile and the grit gauge. We have been refining this for over 3 decades, and we can say with confidence and with a great sense of pride, these are the gold standard when it comes to measuring reliably a person's AQ and grit. And finally, most importantly, these patterns of response, these hardwire patterns, can be rewired and improved. And today, in the short amount of time that we have together, I'm going to share a very simple but compelling way to do this. So here we go. Now, before we dive in, let me just remind you all of what was shown on the opening slide today. If you have questions about anything that me or JP has shared or will share, please take advantage of the text or the Google form, or for those watching through Facebook, take advantage of the chat function, message in your questions, and at the end of this presentation, we'll try to get to as many as possible. So with that, let's jump right in. Now, in order to measure something, we have to understand what comprises it. So when we think of AQ, or adversity quotient, there are 4 dimensions that cumulatively add up to your AQ, and they are control, ownership, reach, and endurance. Let's take a micro look into each of these. Starting with control. The definition is, it's the extent to which you perceive that you can influence whatever happens next. For example, when you first heard about the pandemic cases outside of Wuhan, outside of China, what was your initial reaction? Did you ask yourself, well, considering what's going on before, 2 weeks into, currently, and of course, what lies beyond, what are the facets of this situation that I can potentially influence? And this is a very important question. Notice what it does not say. It doesn't say, well, how can you control this situation? Because to be honest, that would be a bit unreasonable. But what is reasonable is, no matter what the situation is, if you squint your eyes hard enough, if you tilt your head at the right angle, guaranteed there's at least something there that you can influence. Let's take a look at the survey that you guys submitted to us. One of the questions was this: to what extent are you fearful, anxious, or scared on how COVID-19 will affect your own or your family's health and well-being? Well, as we can see from the graphs, not bad. We're talking in 7.7 on average, which is leaning toward the higher side, which means that, yeah, and again, this is quite normal. You were reasonably so fearful, anxious, or scared, and so was I. In fact, I have a 7-month-old daughter who was premature, born 2 months premature. And the last thing I want is to risk her being exposed to what's happening. So definitely, I'm with a lot of you. Honestly, I felt all of those emotions: fear, anxiety, and so on. There was a second question on the survey that said, well, to what extent do you feel that you are in control and can at least influence the things that are happening around you as a result of COVID? Well, we see the bulge is right in the middle, right on the 50-yard line. Not bad, but there's definitely loads of room for improvement. So let me give you a tip, since I think this will help most of you, especially those who answered on the lower side of the spectrum. When we are faced with adversity, what seems to be overwhelming adversity, what is your initial reaction? Well, I'm not a Superman. And like most of you, I had a lot of those same, confessedly so, emotions that you had: fear, anxiety, and so forth. So I asked myself the question, what are the facets of this situation that I can at least potentially influence? So here's my tip to you. Make a list, a very simple list. Make a T chart. On one side or in one column, label it no control, meaning you can absolutely not control these factors. So here are mine from my list: government action, the duration of this quarantine, the response of others, the speed of the vaccine creation and delivery, and the needs of my clients. You know, they're still coming in. I can't control that. However, I also made a separate list of things that I can at least influence / control. And those include my behaviors, my habits during the quarantine, social distancing, my immediate environment. I've never done so much cleaning in my life than being stuck at home for 6 weeks now. My productivity while at home. I'm proud to say that me and my team at Viventus, we have been not only as productive, but more productive during these times. How I communicate with friends, family, how I engage with clients. All of these are very, very important, and also things that I feel confidently that I can at least influence. So from my list, here's what I chose: how I engage with my clients. And I'm sure most of you are probably, experiencing the same concern. In fact, let me ask JP. JP, I know you're also a practitioner of all that I'm preaching here. Could you share
Yes.
with the group when you made your list for this? Because I know you have a list. Could you tell us one of the things that you felt that you could influence during the whole COVID experience?
Actually, James, when I did my own list, because just for context, I have a condition called HPS, or hypersensitive personality. So I can get overwhelmed and I can feel a range of emotions all at once. So when I had the height of my agitations, the first one that I took on was to list down all my agitations and where they are coming from, and then listed them whether I have control over them or I don't, and then simply focus on those that I control. So, for example, one of the things that I can influence back then when the quarantine was announced was that one of my main concerns was the condition of my mom, because she could not sleep for several nights because of being nervous, and I could not personally control that, right? But I can influence it. So somehow I focused on that, and focus on what I can do, and take action based on what I perceive to be something that I can influence.
Fantastic. And that is a shining example. So for all of you listening right now, you can also do this right now. It doesn't take much time. In fact, as you're sitting there listening to JP and I, make a list right now. You're likely to have a journal in front of you or a notebook and pen. Right now, 2 or 3 things that you feel that you can at least potentially influence, or that you are influencing or controlling during the quarantine situation. Now, the whole control aspect of AQ is what I call the first punch in a 2-part combination. So you lead with the control, and then you follow up with the O, ownership, which is your likelihood that you will actually do anything to improve the situation, regardless of your formal responsibilities. Here's the question I'd like you to take down and think to yourself right now. Once you've created that list of things you feel that you can at least influence, choose one like I have, circle it, and then answer this question: how can I step up today to make the most immediate positive difference? Now, when you answer this question, as it aligns with the facet that you've admitted that you can at least influence, be courageous with your timestamp. Don't say, well, maybe next week, or once this whole quarantine thing is finished, or next month. Be bold. Come up with an action that you can do today. So let's take a look at some of your questions from the survey. How clear is your plan of action of you and your team, the people that you work with, for, and manage, in responding to COVID and getting your business back on track? The answer is here. The bulge is, again, close to center line, but leaning toward the high or positive side, meaning you're saying to us that your plan of action is looking pretty good. And I like seeing that. It's showing us that there is a strong sense of ownership for all of you in attendance today. There was another question, you might remember this, which asked, how satisfied are you with how you are guiding and coaching your team? For all of you who are in HR, you have this capacity within you. You have to be able to coach people, not necessarily mentor or even lead, but to help people get past their adversities. And here we can see the bulge again, much like the previous question, is leaning toward the 8 category, which is looking pretty good. So again, if I was to wager and we gave you the AQ profile, I would be willing to bet that ownership is probably, for most of you, your strongest dimension. And if that was true, that would not surprise me. We have assessed over 6,000 Filipinos over the past 5 years using our AQ profile. For 73%, ownership was the highest dimension. Let me give you a counterexample. In the US, where I'm from, we have assessed hundreds of thousands of Westerners, Americans and Canadians. Ownership is our lowest dimension. It's a cultural thing, which of course time is against us. I don't have that much time to go deeply into, but let me just drop a nugget. It is based on geography, your AQ scores, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a few more slides. But let me ask JP again. JP, you had a very good list that you shared, things that you felt you could at least influence. Could you share with everyone? Did you have an ownership action?
Yeah, maybe very recent was, I think everybody knows that ABS-CBN was closed, they signed off last night. And my parents back in the province are actually relying on ABS-CBN on its news and other information that they are able to relay back to my parents. And to me, that is an adversity for my parents, and I could not help but feel for them on that. But I took on this task, and I took ownership of the situation, that I can influence them in teaching them how to uh, to somehow navigate Facebook and look for pages that are reliable for them instead of watching it on TV. Teach them how to somehow look for key sites that they can rely on and they can listen to also. And that's the first and that's the quickest thing I can take on as ownership for them.
Absolutely. And this is off topic, but for the audience, JP's parents are from my wife's province. My wife is from from mother's side of the family are from Capiz, Iloilo, Rojas City to be precise. And yeah, you're exactly the same situation, and we're in constant contact with them too. All right, guys, so let me share my ownership. You saw what I identified earlier as one facet of the situation I can at least influence, and that was I can at least increase my level of engagement with my clients. But the problem is, well, I'm the AQ Grit guy, been so for years. And most of my workshops are conducted face to face. In fact, a lot of you here probably recognize me or have at least attended one of my sessions. And being stuck at home or forced to be at home has been quite challenging. But when I thought about it, I said, well, how can I best or better engage with my clients considering what's going on? Well, the obvious answer was to go virtual and create webinars like today's session. I'm also happy to report that we are in the final stages of converting all of our programs, all of the multiple AQ Grit tracks and other training offerings into webinar format. So if you want to know more about our AQ and Grit offerings, and you want to know what we're doing, what kind of work we're doing behind the scenes in order to convert our previous programs into the virtual world, into webinars, please reach out to us, let us know, because we would be more than happy to help you with this. Now, if control and ownership are that 1-2 punch when it comes to adversity response, we need to look at, okay, well, what happens when adversity swings back once again? Now we need to talk about reach, which is the extent to which you perceive an adversity will reach into and affect other aspects of the situation and beyond. Here's the question. How do I make sure my work adversities do not affect my personal life, my home life, my family, and vice versa? Though people who demonstrate high reach can contain the situation, they can keep their adversities or the effect of their adversities where they belong. If an adversity happens in the morning, don't let it ruin your day. If an adversity happens on a Monday, don't let it spoil your week. If it happens at home, keep it at home. If it happens at work, keep it at work. Now, since most of us are now working at home, boy, does this seem very challenging. Well, once again, let's take a look at the survey. Another question was, what is the level of engagement and morale of your team now as we face this disruption? Happy to report a lot of your answers. Most of the answers were between 7s and 8s. We had a couple of 9s and 10s percentage-wise, and that's awesome. So what you're saying, based on this survey, is that despite the circumstances, the teams that you work with are either as engaged or maybe even more, or higher morale is still being demonstrated within your group organization. If that is true, then that is a shining example of higher reach. And the second question aligned with reach is, what is the extent of this adverse effect that COVID and this ECQ has had on your work and your team's productivity? Now here, we would prefer to see the numbers on the lower side, because when we're talking about adverse effects, negative effects, well, it's reasonable to see what we're seeing on the screen. Absolutely. I mean, this kind of caught us by surprise somewhat, this whole ECQ situation. And of course, that's going to affect the way we work, the way we manage our teams, and our level of productivity. Now, earlier, when I talked about ownership, I shared a little bit of our research where I said that over 70% of Filipinos that we've assessed, those 6,000, ownership was their strongest dimension. Well, here's the bad news. Those same 6,000 plus Filipinos that we've assessed, would you believe 97% reach was their absolute lowest dimension, which is shocking, but not surprising. The same is true throughout Southeast Asia, where we've conducted numerous research. China, South Korea, especially Japan, they all suffer from low reach. And it's a cultural thing. Now, again, with time being against us, I have to be very selective to offer tips, things that we can do to help promote reach within us. So there's a lot to look at on the screen right now, but think about all the things that matter to us most in our lives, whether it's work related or outside of work. We've all heard that term, work-life balance, and those of you in HR, you probably know better than anyone how important that can be. But boy, is it challenging. And what do you do when you have to work from home? And both of these environments are now melded together. Well, let me give you a C word. When it comes to reach, a lot of times we try to keep our adversities inside, the effects of it, the negative effects. And what happens then is it creates a pressure within us. We become almost like a pressure cooker. And the more adversities that happen and we try to keep it inside, oh, we think we're containing it. Well, what ultimately happens is that pressure builds to a breaking point, and eventually it comes out, usually at the most unopportune times. Like, for example, maybe your work stress adds up day after day. And by the end of the week, when you finally can disconnect your laptop and try to spend quality time with your family. Maybe someone in your family, your spouse, for example, does something very trivial, but it annoys you. And then you erupt in a fit of anger. And it's not your spouse's fault. It's not what they did. It's not that fault. Not that adversity's fault. It's all those adversities that added up, that built within you, that you thought you were containing, but you weren't. So the C word is communication. You need to let it out. You need to communicate. You don't need to burden other people with your stress or your worries, but you have to talk. You have to address these feelings and emotions. In fact, JP was talking about this earlier, about those emotional ranges that we can experience, that we are experiencing right now. JP, can you share some of your insight based on what you know, what we know about reach and how this plethora of attributes can be affected?
Yeah, actually, one of the insights that I saw, especially on the second question that we asked everybody in the survey, in terms of what they have done, how they were, and how they reacted 2 weeks after. One thing that I said is an insight earlier is that the quadrant on the calmness was a pivot point for everybody. It was a pivot point whether they will go back to agitation or go back to helplessness or go up to action. To me personally, how I do calmness is to practice mindfulness. So for me, my personal practice of mindfulness is if I'm agitated, if I'm fearful, if I'm anxious, if I'm worried, I know they will not put me to sleep. So what I do there is, first off, I check, I step back. What exactly is this thing that is bothering me? What story is it creating about me? And then that's the time that I detach somehow myself and check whether I can control it or not control it. And if I can control it, I can find way and try to understand what is it that I'm running away from, and then pivot out of my calmness. I pivot. What is a better thing to chase after? What is a better purpose to chase after? What is something that I can look forward to instead of being agitated by this fear or this anxiety that somehow uh, 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 keeps me from being focused and being balanced. So I think the point of calmness, the pivot point of calmness is important. Stepping back is important. So we don't allow the irritation to trickle down to other parts of our lives.
Absolutely. I could not have said that any better. Yeah, step one with almost anything is awareness, understanding where you're at, how you're feeling, and to be honest with those thoughts and feelings. And from there, you can make key decisions, pivotal points, like what JP was sharing. And absolutely. Now, as we move into the fourth and final dimension, let me remind everyone, if you have questions about any of the dimensions that we've shared and will share in just a moment, please again take advantage of the text box. Go ahead and start composing, send them our way, and in just a moment, we'll spend some quality time trying to answer your questions specifically. Well, now this brings us to the fourth dimension, endurance, which is the length of time you perceive the situation or adversity will last or endure. You can almost think of it like optimism versus pessimism. People with high endurance, they always see the finish line. They always, well, they gravitate, they focus toward that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow or the light at the end of the tunnel. However, those who experience or are susceptible to low endurance behavior, well, these are the sour pusses or the sour grapes. These are the ones who never see the ends of their adversities. They, in fact, when you ask them, well, how are you doing? They think, well, don't ask. I mean, the light at the end of their tunnels is just a pinpoint in the distance. Well, the good news is there are no tunnels. In fact, the tunnels are illusions. Our brains create these tunnels. And depending on your level of endurance, this will directly affect how long these tunnels are. So here's our final question. When it comes to endurance, what can I, or we, my team, what can we do to take advantage of the rest of 2020? I mean, we're approaching the halfway mark nearly in a month or two. When this ECQ lives, that's probably where we're going to be at. So what do? Do we give up? Do we say, well, better luck next year? I mean, half the year is already wasted. Why even bother? Well, that's low endurance behavior. High endurance behavior is saying, hey guys, you know what? We still got time. We can turn things around. We can look not just 5 days or 2 weeks from now. We can set the standard for the end of 2020 at the very least. In fact, final set of questions from the survey. How confident are you that your team can bounce back quickly and turn around those results, that dip in productivity that you also shared earlier in the survey, in the next several months? Well, taking a look at the graph here, I'm happy to report that your endurance seems relatively high. Most of you, when you answer this question, you say, hey, you know what? I'm pretty confident that we can get back what we have lost. We can build momentum more and more as we come out of this situation. And that's good to see. Likewise, the final question was, how optimistic are you that your unit will still be able to produce great results by the end of 2020? And again, look at those verticals. I mean, 8 was the overwhelming majority. 32% of you were in the 8 alone category and close to it. That's awesome. Now, going back to the AQ profile I mentioned, our online assessment. Based on what I know from the 6,000 Filipinos we've assessed, I'm sure that most of you listening to my voice right now would probably have, generally speaking, the same results we see in this country. Higher ownership, higher endurance, maybe slightly lower control, and noticeably lower reach. And if that's the case, we need to address that. So with that, let me give some final insight on endurance. As the smoke clears, as we try to return to normal, or this new normal, there's many routes ahead of us, many paths that we can choose. Some look daunting, scary, twisting, winding. Some look straight. Some look like that might be the best way to go. But is it? Think about the most optimal path, not necessarily the shortest or the easiest. Don't be like electricity, trying to take the path of least resistance. That's an easy trap to fall into. Sometimes we have to look at the foggy path, the one that seems unclear. But if you can look past what lies beyond the fog of war, what kind of potential lies at the end of that route, albeit a tough one to navigate? Is that indeed the most optimal path? And can you commit to it? So JP, not to put you on the spot, but let me ask you, because I know you've done this, the core questions. Can you tell us, when you got to endurance, what sort of thoughts were in your mind?
Maybe one thing that really allowed me to reflect a lot for the past 3 weeks is because I've been practicing organizational development for 20 years now, and it's amazing also that a pandemic can change and can possibly change the way we organize ourselves moving forward. And I said, well, I have very little influence over so many organizations and companies in the Philippines. And I can only get in touch with a few at this point in time. And I said, so how can I make sure that whatever insights I get from a number of reviews, of conversations, how can I possibly help out organizations to find their own optimal path? So in fact, after and most likely one key vision, one possible uh, uh, way that organizations will become after COVID is they will need to offer services and products that are mainly and should mainly enhance community or build community and ensure that there is well-being for one another. And that's something that somehow I said, okay, if that's a recovery, it's a new way of it's a chance for organizations to revisit their main organizational purpose. They need to have a way to ensure that that purpose happens in that organization. So what I did was to suggest key ways, like how do you distribute authority, how do you ensure that how do you manage the workforce now that you're gonna have extended workforce, you're gonna have a workforce that's working from home, you will rarely see everybody, etc., except in Zoom or whichever tool that you will put together. So that's what I can influence now. That's helping out not just other organizations but our own organization. How do we find that optimal path where uh, there's this kind of purpose where our main purpose is really build communities and we show care for the well-being of each other. And in fact, in the recent article that I wrote over LinkedIn, and I'll be sharing that to everybody here, and I'll post the link in the chat in a few seconds. It's really really important. This is the best time to, in fact, number one, revisit not just our organizational purpose, but also our personal purpose. I did some very long solitude and silencing time to re-examine my own personal purpose, how it will happen, where I can make it happen, and what and in what ways I can make it happen also. That's very very important. So there, James, it's actually finding an optimal path, not just for myself, but for also the organization that I'm in and the community that I'm in.
Very good. And great advice. And thank you for sharing that article link with us in just a moment. I'm sure everyone will appreciate that. Likewise, let me just expand on my answers to the same questions. I mean, obviously, our Viventus training and development team, we're also considering all those questions you answered in the survey. I mean, what do we want our team to look like, our career life to look like, after this whole ECQ is lifted? And let me just say, it's yes about mindset, but it's also about relationships. What kind of relationships do you have with your team, to the people you work with, both laterally, above and below you? Is it a relationship of trust, camaraderie, respect, loyalty? If the answer is yes, much like it is for our team, well, our paths are quite clear, meaning we are working collectively and collaboratively towards very similar, or in some cases, the same goals. We meet twice a day via Zoom, in the morning and in the evening, at the very least, 5 days a week. We're not forced to, but we keep an Excel spreadsheet, a daily record of our accomplishments, what we want to do, what we're working on, what we're waiting to discuss. And again, we took this initiative on our own. So I really hope that the people you work for, the organizations you represent, have that culture imbibed, embedded within your companies. If the answer is yes, or I think so, well, that's great. But if the answer is, well, I'm not sure, or not really, well, then cultural spring cleaning is in order. We have to build those relationships that you have within your organizations at multiple levels. And boy, can that be challenging. But because it's challenging, we shouldn't just set it aside and say, maybe not. We need to be courageous. We need to grab that bull by the horns. We have to say, yes, this is a problem. This is a concern that we're having. And how do we address it? Now, let's reflect back to what we've just covered. We talked about those 4 dimensions of AQ, CORE. And I've presented 4 questions with each of those dimensions. Hopefully you were writing them down, but if not, don't worry. At the end of today's session, you will all gain access to a PDF version of this presentation. In fact, following this presentation, you'll be asked to give feedback on what you felt, what could be improved, what you liked about the program. Once you've done that, you will be sent a PDF version of the entire presentation. So if you were not taking notes, don't worry, you'll have this at your disposal. So I guess let's go to my favorite part. Let's make this conversational. We want to hear from you, whether you're watching from Facebook or here in the Zoom itself, using the chat function or whatever you have in front of you. Send your questions in. I think, JP, you're going to help me moderate the questions.
Yep. Let's start with the ones that were posted in the Q&A section in Zoom. First question there is, how to encourage resiliency in this new environment we are in, especially that we don't get to see each other face to face. So how can we encourage resiliency?
Oh, great question. And we've actually kind of talked about it somewhat. So yeah, let me just sort of echo back what I shared earlier. Yeah, when people are, we're social creatures as humans, and we need that interaction, that social interaction, in most cases, physical. Now, of course, considering the circumstances, this is not possible. And when we are distanced, social distancing, I don't even like that term, social distancing. I like the term physical distancing. Just because you're physically separated from someone or you're talking to them via Zoom doesn't mean you're socially distanced from them. I mean, you can still maintain that same level of sociability, that same level of communication. You can still make your relationships meaningful and enriching, even though you're talking to a face on the screen, because you're still talking to the same person. Now, this has to be a two-way street. Just because you are exhibiting gritty or resilient behavior doesn't necessarily mean the other person will. So taking what you've learned from today's session, try to apply it, not just to yourself. Try to share this with people that you interact with, those you work with, your teams. When they come back to you, HR, when they come to you with a problem, a challenge, an adversity, with this whole working from home experience, or maybe in some cases, you have to reach out to them because you notice there's something wrong. You can use those same core questions, those 4 questions, and you can flip the script. You can ask them, putting on your coaching hat. Don't tell them what to do, ask them. And let them come up with their own answers. What can they potentially influence? How can they step up? How can they minimize the downside, maximize the upside of this adversity? How can they get beyond this as quickly and as effectively as possible? Try your best, no matter how clever or wise you might be. Try not to, you've heard the proverb, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Well, when it comes to the people that you work with and the people who report to you or who trust and confide in you, don't throw fish at them, no matter how good your fish are. Teach them, ask questions, empower them, let them answer. And as they do, their resiliency will start to go up. So to answer the question, I'm sorry that was a bit winded perhaps, is to, yes, build your own resiliency, but try to pass it on to others. Be a beacon of resiliency. Use the tools that we've just shared today. Now, obviously, if you're like, well, is there more? Absolutely. Like I also mentioned, we have multiple tracks and AQ Grit programs that we've been offering for years now with great success. And as I also mentioned, we are in the final stages of converting all of those tracks into a very tidy, effective, compelling webinar package. If you want to know more, you know where we are, Viventus, reach out to us.
And also, James, if I may add, remember our quadrants earlier?
Oh, yes.
Wearing a coach's hat also, maybe trying to know where is your team in the quadrant, right? You can actually do the same exercise for your team make use of the quadrants to determine where they are, and then check also if they're stuck in one quadrant or not. uh, are they stuck somewhere? If they're stuck, especially in the agitation phase, make use of key questions to let them calm down, and then ask the core questions as you go along. The important thing is they can navigate themselves through the four quadrants also earlier. I'm gonna check a question that's coming uh, from YouTube. One question there is, I think it's also the same, or maybe in, hold on. It's actually related. The question is how to motivate others to practice resiliency. So I think that's very similar. Back to question from Zoom. What can you do to increase your AQ? So especially for those who are here now who somehow has a good sense of where they are in their adversity quotient, what else can they do to increase their AQ?
Oh, great. And yeah, let's broaden that. AQ and grit, both sides of that coin, that mindset coin. Yeah, over the past 30 plus years, we have developed multiple tools, uh, specific tools that people can use to build both sides of that coin, the offense and the defense. Today, you've experienced essentially one of those tools, the core questions. We have a free app that we offer. If you go to your app store and type in the word grit, look for our logo, Peak Learning, look for the muddy footprint, boot print. And there are other tools that you can use there. Very simple, easy to use tools, very user-friendly tools that will help build both sides. Now, as good as that is, there's still a way to improve this process. You reach out to us, allow us to come in, work with your teams, first consult. We need to diagnose where you're at, where you need to be, where you want to be, and then of course, develop a path on how to get there. The process, frankly speaking, is not always easy. It takes time, and more so it takes effort. What the two words that I always present in my workshops, in fact, I always set it up with this: who can tell me what is the secret of success? And immediately people start shouting out words like perseverance, tenacity. Some cheeky people say grit, because they know that's the topic for today. But what they're actually saying boils down, or is all synonymous. It all links to just two words: hard work. Now, for the older people out there, including myself, and in generations before us, we have a deep appreciation, a strong sense of the value that hard work brings. Unfortunately, with each generation that comes beyond ours, it seems like that the term hard work is sort of losing some of its value. People are trying to work, easier, maybe working wise is smart, but if it's about taking shortcuts, it's probably not the best way. We have to often get our hands dirty, put our nose to the grind, and put in the effort. So if you want to promote resiliency, AQ and grit in yourself and the people you work with, first you need to have that strong sense, that willingness to put in the work, and the people you interact with have to have that same level of enthusiasm. So I hope I answered that.
Yep.
Okay, good.
Another question, James, which is, I think, very, very pointed. HR, the HR, any HR practitioner or even the HR department wanted to give more and be more responsive to employees, especially during this time. And yet owners are so conscious of its cost. What's your comment or advice about this? Because this seems to be it. The question appears to be an either or thing, right? But does it have to be an either or thing?
No, absolutely not. It's not all in or all out. You can certainly create, implement, uh, deliver initiatives, interventions to help promote anything, even beyond AQ and grit, whether it's skill-based training, behavior training, cognitive-based training, absolutely. I mean, you're not limited to just classroom environment. There's so many other options. And this is especially true with AQ and Grit. I know I've mentioned this several times already, but not only do we have, webinar versions of our programs, but we have blended learning, ways to connect, to stay connected, to gauge, to encourage, to promote, to coach those people you're interacting with. And as HR, this could not be more important. You need to stay engaged with your people, even if they're working remotely, even if they're working from home and not coming into the office every day. You can still conduct quality training, regardless of the type of training. And this is especially true for AQ and Grit.
Okay. And then I'll check the question from the chat. The question is, what will be the right approach to be used to superiors who are not interested or open and committed to learning new ways of leading people, managing the business operations in the new normal? And related to that, how will you manage superiors so is the cause of agitation in the workplace without doing anything bad against the superior? And how will an individual manage himself or herself in a fixed situation wherein she or he is pushed back to the wall for years because of the superior?
Okay, I have a very simple answer to it. It's called mutiny. No, just kidding, not mutiny or resignation, right? No, I hear this question all the time. And I've lived and worked in the Philippines for over 12 years now. And I've dealt with multiple clients across multiple industries. And when I conduct my workshops, I always get that hand at some point. Sir, we love what you're saying. We agree. We understand the importance. But if I try to communicate in a Grisilient way to my superior, they're not going to respond back in a very positive way. And unfortunately, that is a culture within some organizations, especially as you go up the taxonomy of your organization, or those who are from a previous generation, let's say, old school. Yeah, that's a reality. And think about that list that we talked about with control, those things that you can absolutely not control, and those other facets that you can at least potentially influence, maybe control. So when it comes to the reaction of our superiors, when we try to stand our ground or respectfully challenge a decision that they're making, and when we're trying to demonstrate our resiliency or even pass it on upwards within our organization, there are times where they'll push back or they won't receive it very well. So can we control that? Probably not. I mean, especially if they're above us in terms of age. They're probably pretty much set in their ways. But there is something there you can control. It's you. How do you respond to their response? Do you take it personally? Do you pull your hair out like me? And do you become frustrated? Does a feeling of resentment appear within you? And remember when we talked about reach, when that spark of resentment or stress or that frustration, and you're thinking, oh, I just can't get through with my leader. What do? Well, if you can't control them necessarily or directly, you can control the way you respond. And let me try to answer that question in a slightly different way. As we respond to situations like our management, for example, who cares what they think? As long as you are doing what you know you should, could, and based on your integrity, will be doing, who cares? You are the one who lives your life. Yes, other people will come in and out. Yes, you will influence and they will influence you in different ways as you navigate through your lifetime. But another aspect of resiliency is loving yourself, trusting yourself. And if you are following the steps toward resiliency, I can promise you that even if others don't follow you or even react to you the way you were hoping to, Well, then sometimes we have to just move forward with what we know. What we know will improve our outlook, our experience. When you look back on your life, as you become retired, you move into your twilight, your golden years, as you look back on your life, the last thing you want is regret or to look back and say, gosh, I wish I could have done that or would have done that. Well, you have control of that now. So, whatever decisions you make from now moving forward, regardless of who you're making these decisions with or against, perhaps, these are still your decisions. So, you are in control in that aspect.
Okay. Thank you, James. Another question here. So, what is the next step after developing an AQ mindset? Because I think this is very important because it's not just all about mindset. It should go down to skill set and then go down to tool set also. How can our team apply this in adapting to the new normal?
Oh, fantastic. Now, I don't want to give you the cheap answer, but let me just share a tool that we use in most of our workshops. It falls on the grit side mostly. It's called the Gritty Game Plan. And what we have our participants do is first they establish a very compelling, but very gnarly or gritty, challenging goal that requires sacrifice, struggle, and suffer. I mean, this is a prerequisite in order to do the gritty game plan. We even have a checklist, in fact. And once they've ticked off all the check marks, is it tough enough? Yes. Will it is it the best possible goal that me and my organization can achieve? Yes. So on and so forth. Once that's been established, they develop a very precise, articulate, well-defined action plan that is based around the 4 dimensions of grit, which of course we didn't have time to explore today. But in a future webinar, which we'll be promoting, I presume, in a short time ahead, there are 4 dimensions of grit: growth, resilience, instinct, and tenacity. And those 4 dimensions come with their definitions, tips on to improve, and questions that should be asked. So what they essentially do is they create a very concise action plan anchored on those 4 GRIT dimensions: growth, resilience, instinct, and tenacity. And it doesn't stop there. Just because you've established a plan of action, doesn't mean it's going to work. You have to monitor. You have to not just plant the seeds, you have to water them. You have to maintain them. You have to make sure they're growing. And of course, ultimately, you want to harvest the results of that action plan. So again, going back to the app that I mentioned, there's one of the tools there is the Gritty Game Plan, a condensed version of it. There's also a tool there called Grit Goes. Check it out. Check out those questions. Use them with your teams. And let me offer this to you. You can also email me after today's session. If you have questions on how to use these tools, the one that I shared today, the core questions, or the ones that are in the app, reach out to me, reach out to us, our team. And I would be more than happy to either guide you on the use of these tools or help you explore some of our more robust programs that we could offer you.
Yeah. And then another question also, James, can you share some employee engagement activity or activities that can promote more grit to our work from home setup?
Oh,
This reminds me actually, James, of what we do every Monday. So just to share to everybody, every Monday we give high fives to everybody virtually. So for example, and we do this regularly on Mondays. Well, I tell everybody, I give a high five to James for continually doing this, that, and that, etc. So that's very, very important. Affirmation is a basic need for our teams, especially as they work from home. So I think to me, what is effective during work from home settings is to continue to affirm each other in terms of progress. Another one is on a daily basis, we ask each other, okay, what's up for your day? Okay, what do you have in store for your day, and what help do you need during the day? So that's a way also for us to know whether somebody badly needs an SOS. James, anything to add to that?
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Mondays for most people are gloomy, are not things we look forward to. But for us, for our team especially, Mondays are awesome. In addition to the high fives, in addition to what we're doing and what we need help with, we it's also our team building, our weekly team building. Uh, Jen from our team create outfits of the day for Mondays. We reserve time for some sort of game that we can play together. We can interact and engage. We're considering having a wellness Wednesday, something physical, health-wise that we can do. Both JP and I are quite versed in that. So yeah, and we love doing this. This is not something we were forced to do by management or something that was told to us to do. This is something we took on our own. And I can honestly say it's been awesome. So give it a try with your teams. See how it goes.
Yep. And then another question, how is AQ related to one's mental health?
Oh gosh. Wow. That's a broad question, but let me try to add what I shared earlier. When I was talking about the human brain, for example, and hardwire patterns of response. Yes, it is true that the way we respond to adversity is a hardwired pattern of the brain. Uh, but when we hear this, we think, well, then what can I do? I mean, if this is a part of my brain, this is the way my brain thinks. So if my brain is thinking in a low AQ way, this of course is going to have a negative effect on my mental health. And the answer is, yep, you're right. But it doesn't have to be that way. Due to a term called plasticity, and I'll try not to get too technical, our brains are very powerful, but our brains are also very efficient. When you consciously think about something, that requires energy from your brain. When your brain figures out, wait a minute, I don't need to consciously focus to do this, well, then it sends it to what we call our autopilot, our subconscious. And over time, this process becomes habitual or hardwired. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be that way. Let me give you an example that I sometimes give in my workshops, a hardwire pattern. Something that this is a positive hardwire pattern that when we experience it, it increases our mental wellness. It's called laughing. Think about it. When you laugh, when you hear or see something funny, and you find it humorous in some way, think about what's happening in your body at a neurochemical level. Yeah, the input goes to your brain, parts of your brain light up, chemicals get released through your system, endorphins. It triggers a physical response, giggling, laughing. That sound that comes out of your mouth, that laughter. Did you consciously choose the way you laugh? Or did it just come out? Chances are it just came out. Whether it was he or ho, it came out. Now, the question is, where did that come from? At some point in your early life, did you consciously choose that to be your laughter? No. Here's what happened. From the time that you were a child, toddler, we moved through our environments like little vacuum cleaners, absorbing people's laughter subconsciously from the people that were around the most, family members, classmates, teachers, and this is all subconscious. We absorb 10% from dad, 12% from mom, 15% from my favorite cartoon character. And by the age of puberty, 13, 14, it begins to firm. And by the time we're young adults, 18, 19, 20, it becomes a hardwire pattern. And from that point, it's going to stay that way unless you consciously try to change it. Now, going back to what I shared earlier, when you consciously try to do something, that requires energy. The question now goes is, do you have that energy? Or can you tap that energy in order to change the way your brain responds? Not to something funny, but to something not so funny, like adversity. So when adversity strikes, the next time it happens to you, in fact, you're all going to get a homework assignment in just a moment. when we talk about that homework assignment, I'm probably going to go back, reflect back to this question and reinforce it with how you can rewire and change the way you respond to adversity, thereby directly affecting your mental health.
Yep. And interestingly, James, you talked about laughing. I just found out last week, laughing for 15 seconds per day increases one's immune system. So
Absolutely.
that's a
Absolutely.
interesting fact about laughing. Now, our next question is something that I think you can relate very well. As father and husband working from home, how can I balance both responsibilities?
Oh gosh. Well, you don't need me to tell you this. In fact, a very modest Google search, because in the time, ECQ is global right now. If you just type in best practices of working from home, you will see loads of information and lists. So you don't necessarily need me for that. But since the question was directed toward me, let me just share what I've been doing. As I mentioned earlier, I have a 7-month-old daughter who now I get to spend a load of time with. In fact, I'm going to be kind of sad going back to work, even though I literally work right across the street. I'm walking distance from my office, which is a plus. But this whole experience, I am an outdoors person. I enjoy exercising outdoors. I enjoy going to the mall with my wife, moving around, spending quality time, bonding time, and of course, going to her family's house every Saturday in Antipolo, spending time with them literally every Saturday and Sunday. We haven't been able to do that, but several times a day, of course, we use Messenger. My in-laws can see the baby. We call her Gummy. That's not her real name. And I love this. Now, the whole working from home part, okay, yes, I'm at my dining room table. Yes, I live in a 1-bedroom condominium. It's kind of small. We have 3 other adults living with us, my wife, the Yaya, and my adult nephew who's with us. We weren't planning for him to be here, but we all got locked down. He got stuck here. But it's great. I mean, he chips in with the chores as well. So you can imagine all these people in one small space. It's almost like a refugee center. But again, I love it. I love having people around me, family, friends, whoever. And as far as working from home, I have a designated area, a space that's only used for work. Even though it's at the dining room table, I don't eat there. That's my office. So that when I sit there, my mindset is work, and then I'm less distracted. I'm less tempted to do other things outside of work. And it helps me remain productive. So no matter how small your living conditions are, establish a place that you can call your own, whether it's for work, meditation, or just to get away from everyone else that's around you, even if it's just for 30 minutes a day. Make it your space.
Yeah. And then going back to how we do business, also, the next question is, how do you manage cautious endurance for optimal business performance and realistic projections? I think we should be very clear about the term endurance. It doesn't mean effort all the time. This requires movement of both effort and recovery. I think that's a very important thing to get across everybody. Endurance doesn't mean you keep on pushing and pushing and pushing without recovering and resting, right? So what's your take on this, James? How do you manage cautious endurance for optimal business performance and realistic projections?
Absolutely. Now, I know I mentioned the term optimism versus pessimism when I talked about endurance. Now, when we say optimism and pessimism, on the optimism side, we don't mean happy-go-lucky pipe dream level optimism. We're talking reasonable optimism, knowing what lies ahead, including the positive and the negative. And let me just extend what you were talking about, JP. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes when we choose a path, a gritty path, an optimal path that we feel is optimal, we don't always make the best decisions immediately or the first time. Sometimes there are moments where we hit a blockade, a barrier, and in some cases, an impenetrable barrier. Well, what do you do? Now, some people might think, well, in James's webinar, he said endurance is all about keeping your nose to the grind, your pedal to the metal, and just keep going forward. Well, not exactly. It's about also having the ability to step back, take a bird's eye look at what's going on, is the path that you're on, is it indeed still optimal? Or do some adjustments need to be made? And in a lot of cases, we have to reroute, reassess, reroute, and find alternative ways. Remember, most roads in life, literally and figuratively, have ways to go sideways. There are intersecting roads, forks in the roads. There are other options out there. So try not to fall slave to false optimism or unreasonable optimism. Try to keep the peripherals open. Allow yourself to be agile, to create options, plan Bs, plan Cs. So if things don't go the way you were hoping, at least then you have alternative routes.
Yep. And also, as I stated in my article in LinkedIn, James, the kind of planning that we have to do nowadays will have to be short term. Um, Precisely because circumstances are changing also in the short term, depending on how the pandemic is evolving. We don't know if uh, this is the only case we will have. So we honestly do not know what will happen in the future. So most likely planning will be a little bit more short term, and a lot of revisits of planning will have to happen. So a lot of going back to the drawing board will happen for organizations. Now,
Yep.
going back, James, to control, ownership, reach, and endurance, a question here is, among the four dimensions, which one is the most important?
Oh, God. That's in my top 3 FAQs. I guess the short answer is it depends on which one's the lowest for you. If you were to be assessed using our AQ profile, obviously you're going to have strengths and weaknesses when it comes to those 4 dimensions. And like I shared earlier, for most Filipinos, reach seems to be the most challenging dimension. Not saying that that would be true of you or for those listening, but it's likely. Now, all 4 dimensions are important. Dare I say equally important. But if you are assessed and you notice a stalactite under one of those dimensions, that's probably where you're going to want to start, to focus on the weaker aspects so that you can catch it up, build it to at least the same degree, if not close, to some of your strengths.
Yep. And if you ask me, James, personally, if I choose among the 4, I would choose ownership, because it's a point of choice. If I own a situation, that means to say I'll take control. I make sure that I manage the reach, and I make sure that I will endure it, because it's something that's coming from inside. It's coming from my own personal purpose, right? It's actually a point of a choice, but that's a personal thing that I also myself am trying to grow in.
It,
Uh,
it's it's funny you say that because that's also mine. As a typical American or Westerner, ownership, when I first took the assessment, 6+ years ago, ownership was my lowest dimension. And it still is actually. But it's something that I've been consciously working on and something I still need to work on. Even though I'm the AQ grit guy and I've been so for years, doesn't mean I'm perfect. In fact, my AQ score is not high. It's not bad. It's above average, but it could be much higher. And ownership is, for me, subjectively, the most important dimension because it is the most challenging one for me.
yeah. There are 2 related questions here. One is, what is the difference between emotional quotient and adversity quotient? In relation to that, what's the relationship between grit, mindset, and EQ? Sometimes they are confusing. There are so many assessments to identify leaders with high EQ. Does that mean that they have grit and the right mindset? And as far as I can remember, James, Dr. Goldman ensured that EQ is brought down to key competencies of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and social management. But as far as I can see it, the difference is whether you manage things in a normal situation or in an abnormal situation. I think there are overlaps there, but I think you, as the expert in AQ, you can shed some more light on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And me and you both, JP, we're quite familiar with a lot of the programs that exist. Let me talk about the distinction between EQ and AQ, because again, that's a very common question that I get. IQ aside, I don't know. Let's bring IQ into the conversation. They all three have something in common, which is the term quotient, meaning this thing is measurable. We can measure intelligence. We can measure how we respond emotionally to different things. What is our quote unquote level of empathy when it comes to certain situations, and that's EQ. But AQ is there are elements of AQ that do overlap with EQ, namely reach, allowing the effects of your adversities to spill over into other aspects of your lives. Obviously, this falls into the realm of emotional response to some degree. So EQ and AQ are connected in that sense. But for the most part, AQ and EQ are quite independent of one another. But if someone said, well, James, which one is more important? My EQ, emotional quotient, or my AQ? And I would say they're both important. But if you had to promote one first, you absolutely should go with AQ. Because, and like what you just said, JP, it's one thing, and it's an important thing, to know and understand your emotional response, the way your emotions are affected when things happen, and to recognize this in other people, invaluable. But AQ goes beneath that. It's sort of the foundation. It undergirds EQ. It supports it to a sense. What is your emotional state? What is your level of empathy when things go awry? Likewise, strength, your strengths. Everyone, I'm sure here, PMappers, HR, you're all familiar with Strengths Finder. I'm a big fan of it as well. I believe it's in 2.0 version. We have video of Tom Roth from Strengths Finder on stage with Dr. Paul Stoltz, our global director. And in that video, he is saying, hey, Strengths Finder, you need it. But before you go with our program, you need this AQ and grit. You've heard of 7 Habits. We have Kobe on record in writing saying, before you do my 7 Habits, you got to have AQ and grit. We have a book out, The Adversity Advantage. Kobe wrote the foreword in it. And in that, he said exactly that. So AQ and grit is not meant to replace any of those programs that exist, those multitudes, MBTI, DISC, LIFO, Strengths Finder. I love them all, and they're all useful. But AQ and grit is the bedrock of human endeavor. If you were to choose one to do first, I would say AQ and grit.
Yeah, and just to add to that, James, also, I remember Dr. Duckworth, who has been very vocal about grit, also says that developing grit starts with romance. Romance means you're passionate about something. You recover a certain core attraction for something. There is desire there. It's grit starts from there. A certain attraction to something or to a form of mastery, and then you start to be precise about it. You try to discipline yourself like those martial artists. I myself, I'm a trained Muay Thai practitioner, and I've been doing Muay Thai for about 8 years. And one thing that when you start to be passionate about something, you try your best to reach a certain precision. And in the same way then that when we face adversity, if we find a certain way to be precise about how we tackle adversity by using the core skills, I think that's important. And then we integrate that to our life. We integrate that to, in a sense, make it normal to us. And then that's the time we reach a certain level of resilience. In fact expect difficulties, and we expect a number of stumbling blocks along the way. But the idea there is, how do we turn these stumbling blocks into stepping stones, right? So I think that's one thing we can add.
Absolutely.
I'm being conscious of time. I'm sorry we cannot accommodate all questions at this point in time. And I'll hand over the floor now to again to James for a very important thing, because what we really want to happen is for you to transfer what you have learned in this session to reality, to practice. So go ahead, James.
Very good. Thank you, JP. And you may have noticed on a couple of those questions in the beginning, in a sense, they were asking, well, after today's session, how do I build my AQ and grit? How do I promote AQ and grit in my teams? And I gave very general responses, one for time, and two, because I knew that I would be giving this as a quote unquote homework assignment. So here's what I'd like everyone here to do. And this is something that I personally do. In fact, I'm going to show you my journal in just a moment. We call it the adversity journal. Starting today, in fact, when you go to bed later tonight, what I want you to do is, it could be a pen and paper. You can type it in a Word document. You can use the video recording function on your mobile device. You can just recite it into your phone, but make a list, document all of your daily work and home or non-work related adversities, small, medium, and critical. All that you can remember from the time that you woke up until the time you go to bed tonight. From the small adversities like that alarm clock this morning when it went off, and all the adversities in between, document them. Step 2, beside each of those adversities, assign a number between 1 and 5. 1 is the lowest, 5 is the highest, in terms of how positively you responded to each of those adversities. So a 1 would be not very well. A 5 would be, I harnessed the situation, I took full advantage, and I converted it into an opportunity for myself. That would be a 5. Next, at the end of each week, now today is Wednesday, so obviously by the end of the week, let's say Sunday, because weekends count, reflect back on your journal. Take a look at it, open it up, listen to it. I keep an Excel spreadsheet. That's the best way for me to track and calculate an average. And refer back. What kinds of adversities are you giving 1s and 2s to? And what other kinds of adversities are you giving 4s and 5s? And trust me, after 2, maybe 3 weeks of doing this, you will see a trend. I did. There are some kinds of adversities that, honestly speaking, I don't do very well responding to. But there are other adversities that I do respond to quite well. Once you've established this, here's the final step. I want you to ask yourself, on a weekly basis, what am I doing differently with those higher scoring adversities that I'm not doing with the lower scoring? Apply it. Try to leverage your strengths with your weaknesses. Now, you'll have to take a very sober look at those adversities and the numbers you've assigned. It's easy to fall into denial. It's easy to fall into avoidance. So try to keep that running on the software in your head. Try not to fall victim to these behaviors. Be aware, grasp, understand, and put in the effort. This journal seems like effort, but trust me, it's not. It's habitual for me. In fact, let me show you my journal. This is not my full journal. This is just a snippet. And the date is, ambiguous. So on the left, we have my adversities. For example, my alarm did not go off. How did that affect me? I gave it a 3. I was slightly panicked, but overall, I was able to catch up my time, and I was able to not be late for my morning huddle. Slipped on my child's toy. Yeah, when I woke up this morning, I'm a bit groggy and wasn't paying attention. I ended up stepping on a very hard plastic object, which caused me to slip and fall. And I screamed, I yelled some choice words. I won't say what those words are. but it wasn't a very positive response. Anger, flush face, wanting to throw something, but I calmed down. So it wasn't the worst possible reaction, but it was a 2. It was pretty low. As most of you know, if you've been to a grocery store, there is a massive line because they have a certain number of people they allow inside. When I'm stuck in a long line at the grocery store, what do? Do I complain? Do I give ugly looks to everyone around me or whatever? No, I actually embrace the situation. I bring a book with me. I bring something to read because I know what to expect. I know it's going to take hours just to get into the grocery store. So I've maximized that adversity. What happens when I don't meet a project deadline? Well, I can honestly say, yes, it affects me, but I give it a 4. I commit to do something better the next time. I analyze the situation. I figure out where I went wrong or where my team went wrong. What did I do? Or what could I have done better? So I turned that into a somewhat positive adversity. And finally, here's one that some of you, hopefully not, but maybe some of you have experienced. You discover someone you know, someone close to you, whether it's a neighbor, friend, family member, has contracted COVID. Well, my wife's uncle contracted it and passed away a week ago. And it was, very close to the family, a very meaningful member of the family, her Tito. And we were deeply worried when he was in the hospital. In fact, when they released him, he actually tested, he was positive at first, went through the process, went through the quarantine, and then he tested negative and then cleared him to go home. 2 days later, he got pneumonia and passed away. So that really affected us. And I can be honest with myself to say, yes, our response wasn't very positive. We were quite sad and we were in mourning, still are in mourning. So yeah, that can certainly happen, even to the most gritty of us. So anyways, that's just a snippet from my journal. Try to keep yours, be honest with your numbers, and it just doesn't have to be a number. Do what I did. Try to create a narrative. What did you do exactly? What kind of response did you exhibit? And that's it.
Okay, so just to summarize everything that we have gone through in this webinar, 3 points. First is you, dear learners and participants, you are capable of navigating adversity and make use of it as an opportunity to live a good life. Okay? You are capable of navigating that. Secondly, we challenge you to practice control, ownership, reach, and endurance in all facets of your life, on all adversities that come and go in your life right now, no matter how small. And lastly, find your most optimal path to live your personal purpose. This is the best time to remember what is the most important and the most relevant for us. This allows us to be, the moment you find your anchor, you will be very, very creative. You get to evaluate how you want to live all facets of your life. So once again, thank you for your participation. We hope that this session was helpful for you. And just a reminder to our participants, please answer the post-webinar survey of PMAP upon leaving the session. The survey will automatically open in a new tab on your browser. A big thank you to you, James, James Hargrove, everybody, and to PMAP. And please stay safe, everybody.
And to you also, JP.
Yeah. And till next time, this is JP Villanueva. Have a great week ahead, everyone. Thank you.
Take care. Ingat.
Take care, everybody.